All right, what is up, everyone? Welcome back here to another Lure Lab episode on Sirius Angler Network. And as always, I am your host, the captain, Andrew Full. And you will notice that I have some bags underneath my eyes. It is the month of May. Smallmouth fishing is insane right now on Lake Erie out of Buffalo, New York. We have about 20 days of guiding in already this month with only one cancellation, which never happens in the month of May. So I am tired, but we're going to knock out this awesome episode for you today. And we have a sweet guest coming on in Joe Labarbera. He's fishing the Bassmaster EQs, trying to qualify for the Elite Series. But the reason why I have Joe joining me on this episode is he is a tackle junkie. But the importance of this episode goes deeper than just tackle. We're actually talking when you should use what type of line and why. And I think that's a rather important topic that we need to discuss here on the lab because, I mean, there's a lot of questions I get in my personal inbox about like setups I use for smallmouth fishing and largemouth fishing and types of line. And these are all like general questions that my clients ask me as well when they get on my boat. So I want to have a general discussion here with Joe. So let's get him on here and break down when and why we should use what type of line. And it's all dependent on technique. So that's why it's important. What's up, buddy? How you
Yeah.
doing? You're like living the long road life and traveling all over the country. I feel like you're in Oklahoma one day and then Pennsylvania the next, and now you're down in like Alabama having a time on Gunnersville. And it's kind of cool to watch your progression this year as you're trying to make a living there in the opens, right? Like it's got to be a
Yeah.
grind.
Oh, dude, it's Opens purgatory. Like it's so I mean, it's awesome. I'm enjoying this opportunity. I mean, you said as I try to qualify for the elites. I mean, I've been really open with you guys when you've had me on your other shows. Like, I'll try to qualify. I guess I'm always trying to qualify, but like,
That's all we can do is try.
Yeah, like I'll take it really seriously when I feel like my skills are there, when I feel like the business that I'm trying to build, matches up with those skills. Like I'm not there. I didn't have high school or college fishing. Like I'm still learning, but I'm one of the blessed ones that gets to learn on the road 9 weeks of the year and travel because of my jobs I have in the fishing industry allow me to work remotely a lot and allow me to over a lot. So I'm pretty lucky, but I'm stoked about our topic today. You and me and Bailey and Deke, we've all talked about the equation and the system so many times. I'm excited to nerd out with you tonight.
Yeah, lines, knots to hooks. Like there's so many different things. There's so many different like styles that you can play around with these types of lines. And you have your basic ones that have been around since the beginning of like nylon line, right? Which is now basically braid and it's the superior of super lines. And then you have monofilament, which turns into a stretchy rubber band, and you have fluorocarbon, which is invisible. And I really I don't want to dive into fluorocarbon first because I think there's a lot of cool aspects with fluorocarbon that are overlooked by a lot of people, but like the nuances of line size is so important there with fluorocarbon. But I mean, where do you want to start? Do you want to start with monofilament because that's like the OG new super line that came out in like the 80s, I think, and it's like a mainstay now, basically a real filler. But when and where and why should someone throw monofilament?
Well, I mean, monofilament, at its very core, it floats, right? It has very buoyant principles. It also has, like you said, very stretchy principles. So, I mean, if you are new to fishing, monofilament is your least expensive. So first and foremost, it's probably the easiest option for you to get into. And then you just have to know where it performs the best, right? And a 12-pound monofilament performs nothing like a 12-pound fluorocarbon or a 12-pound braid. It's very stretchy, but since it's stretchy, it does not have a lot of sensitivity. So the smaller sizes, they aren't great for anything bottom contact wise. Like I would never use a jig fishing, but it's got its place for top water baits like a popar or a walking bait, since it floats. Both of those baits have treble hooks, so its stretchy principles allows you to keep those fish pinned pretty well. I mean, I grew up fishing a lot of baits on mono for a very, very, very long time, and it wasn't until fluorocarbon started getting really good that I really made that transition. And I grew up river fishing a lot, and we fished with treble hook baits like a rattle trap, a small stick bait like a 3 1/4 inch stick bait, and a square bill. We used them a lot, and monofilament performs great if you're not a super high level tournament angler. If you're not fishing around grass, and especially if you're fishing reaction baits, monofilament works really good. There's definitely a place for it in fishing. It's not obsolete.
And now, would you say with monofilament too, like a big thing that you can mess around with on it is not just technique. So, like top waters is the only time I will ever throw it in like a 15-pound test, but you can also get away with a slightly stiffer rod with monofilament. You don't want to be throwing it on like a composite deep bend parabolic rod. You want to go something that's got like a fast tip or even an extra fast tip when you're walking a topwater bait, because it has stretch. If you go with that composite rod, right? Like, you can tell me if I'm completely wrong here, but when you have a composite rod and you have monofilament, you're like doubling your stretch factor. You're going to lose so many fish, just basically springing elasticity, just popping right out.
Yeah. So like, you don't have the ability to quickly get tension on a fish when there's all that stretch in the system, right? So you may be talking about making shorter casts so that there isn't as much stretch across that system from rod tip to bait. And, there's just understanding the principles of that line, that connection to your rod, from your bait to your rod, like just understanding what it's good for and understanding what you are using. Kind of, I mean, like you and I, right? We have unlimited access to whatever we want to use, but not everybody does. So getting, building that knowledge of what equipment you're using is why we're doing this episode together. And so, yeah, you may want to focus on shorter casts. You may want a stiffer rod. You need to understand this part of your equation in order to be the most efficient with your money, the most efficient with your choices of other gear too.
Yeah. And I mean, like I mentioned it before too, like monofilament, one of the things I love to do, you can go to like your local Walmart or whatever your tackle store is. Shakespeare makes a great line for reel backing called Omniflex. I think it's like $3.79 for 1,000 yards. And it's fantastic for filling the back of your spools. But Joe, like maybe name off a couple of your favorite monos that you would use for topwater fishing. Like I have mine, and there's only one in my opinion that's good for topwater fishing, so I'll let you do yours first.
So really the only one that I've found that's high level, and I haven't tried a lot, so the one that I found, I just keep buying it, is I'll buy 20-pound, or it's Sunline Armelio, I think it's called. It's just a really, really high end mono. Seagar used to make a great one. I don't think they make it anymore. It came in like this teal box. I used to love it, and I used to run that in 20-pound too. Never have it anymore. So I mean, as brands keep changing what their stuff is, it's hard to keep up. And I mean, I've been sitting on like 1,000-yard spool of that Sunline for quite a while, and it ain't going anywhere. I don't respool that rod too often.
Right? Like mono, just it might coil up and it's easy to replace. But I mean, the best mono topwater I've ever found, and it's kind of a hybrid line, which we're gonna jump into this line class next. But have you ever used the Sunline Shooter Defier, like the nylon monofilament like mix? Another one was like Yozuri Hybrid, was the same way.
I've heard of that. I've heard that's really good stuff.
You don't want to bite that line with your teeth. Like normal monofilament will just fall apart. Make sure you use scissors, but it's got the stretchiness like monofilament, but it's very, very tough and abrasion resistant. And I like that line for topwater, and it floats amazingly for that sunline to fire. So
Yeah,
yeah.
stuff that's abrasion resistant. It for us living in zebra mussel country, sometimes zebra mussels will stick to that grass that and end up floating grass. So the more abrasion resistant, the better.
Or just throwing it around docks and
Yeah.
trees and just instead of ripping it apart. But we're talking that nylon line-esque, like we're gonna jump right into braid, like one of the superior super lines. And what people might not realize, and I figured this out probably like 4 or 5 years ago, not all braid is the same. And I think we can kind of get nerdy in this topic because there is so much to braid that doesn't even meet the eye if you don't have the general knowledge of like the numbers on the packaging. So like,
Oh God, yeah.
yeah. So I mean, we could start there, right? Like, I don't know what brand it is, but isn't there a brand that has like a 3 carrier strand count? And then you have some brands that are all the way up to a 12. So kind
Yeah.
of talk through what the carriers are on braid. So the folks at home who are listening and tuning in on YouTube understand what we're talking about when it comes to
All
braid.
right. So braided line is they take many fibers, and that's what we're talking about, right? Carriers, the number of fibers, and they start to weave them together. All right. So if you have a 3 carrier braid, to make this really simple, they're basically taking 3 strands and interweaving them together, pull and getting them super tight. And that's how you build a super line, a braided fishing line. Andrew and I both enjoy the wonders of cast fishing companies, 12 carrier braid, which we love for what it is. It's an amazing thing. But what they take then is well, I only have 10 fingers, but they take 12 carriers and weave them all together in a super compact structure. And then they put a coating on it, a Teflon coating on it. And that keeps water from getting into those nylon carriers so that they don't get weighed down, so they can keep their floating principles so that the line lasts longer. And anytime you have a 12 carrier braid, in a 20-pound test, and a 3 carrier braid in 20-pound test, the 12 carrier, since they have to make those fibers so much smaller to get to that 20-pound test, it becomes so much smoother, and it flies through that guides or through your guides. When you make a cast, it feels super smooth coming back through your guides when you have a fish on, when there's tension or load on that system. I mean, your higher carrier braids are going to cost more because it takes so much more technology to build that line. It's a more superior product, but that's not to say that you're not getting a great product from some 4 carrier braids as well.
Right. All right. So let's nerd out here for a second. And a lot of people might overlook this fast and they just walk into like they're shopping online, right? Like Omnia. There's probably 15 different braids you can choose from, but the average person listening or out fishing doesn't understand the difference between a Power Pro regular braid to a cast braid, right? That you can only get on the cast website. Like, why are some braids noisy and then why are some silky smooth and quiet?
Well, I mean, again, the higher carriers make each fiber much thinner. Then they become really tight. And then when they coat them, it just makes that overall much, much smoother.
So are you proposing that everyone who buys braid should look for like a coated braid? Because I know some braid companies don't coat braid, like won't coat the line, and then you're flipping grass and you just hear and it's like humming and ripping through that grass. So like, can you talk about the importance of having a coated braid as opposed to a non-coated braid and why it's important to have one or the other?
I mean, so to me, you're going to get a lot longer life out of a coated braid. You're going to get a lot smoother surface. I mean, so if we're really going to nerd out, I mean, you can go to there's Cortland braid, and there's another brand that make their braid super high carrier, and they actually make it flat so it slices through grass better, so it doesn't hum. I mean, fish are getting smart to some of the noises and vibrations and different things that we put into their ecosystem. I mean, so if you want to nerd out, if you're one of those that believes that fish are adapting to our presence around them, um, there are a lot of people that swear by saying you have to do the smoothest stuff you can. You have to avoid putting off vibrations into the water to maximize your fish catching ability. And then there are a lot of people that are just like, fish don't know. It's that it becomes the same type of conversation as the forward facing sonar, often argued topic. So like, if this is what you choose to nerd out on, there are certain things like that to consider. I mean, for me, my rules are really simple. I just don't throw braid on moving baits like an A rig or anything. Not just because there's no stretch to that system, but because I believe that I get more bites on a different type of line than braid whenever I'm using a moving bait. I don't like the vibrations that it gives off. I've noticed differences in the numbers of bites that I've gotten in the same day when I've had both rods rigged up. Some people feel the same about their flipping technique. That's why they go to a coated one. What do you think? Like, I don't know that you and I have ever actually nerded on this topic together.
No, not on braid. Like, braid to me is braid's tough for me because I use it a ton because I'm a smallmouth guide, and that's like one of the biggest things I do. And I want the smallest, smoothest, quietest diameter braid I can find. That's why I like the cast braid. A couple other braids that are not bad, but I find they get bunched up really fast is like a Daiwa J braid. Like fantastic for the first like 50 uses or 50 fish, and then you have to cut 10 yards off and run it through the line and get it unswaveled. But I don't mind J braid, but when it comes to like grass flipping and frogging, I think this is where it can get really complicated when you're moving up into like that 40, 50, 65-pound braid line area. Top water braid, I want something that's super smooth. I can cast it extremely far distance. But I think where it can become convoluted is the difference between like flipping and punching braid to frogging braid. Because I feel like when you're frogging, having noise, it doesn't matter all that much because it's just coming across. Everything's making noise. I don't think it bothers the fish. But when you're punching, you want something that's relatively quiet because a smooth braid, in my opinion, is going to get through grass a lot easier. It's going to get to the bottom of the grass mat a lot easier, as to where if you have a noisy braid or a non-coated braid, it's going to catch every follicle on that grass on the way down and whatever's there. And I find that the non-coated braid as well also tends to bunch up more. You get more wind knots as opposed to a super slick braid.
Yeah. I agree 100%. I mean, I'll tell you guys right now. So, and I'm like you, right? I grew up in Clearwater fisheries, mostly smallmouth, spend a lot of time with braid and small diameters. I mean, cast braid, I've used it all the way up to 50 pound. And the 50 pound is like somewhere between 30 and 40-pound diameter for a lot of other brands. I mean, I love it. I mean, I will do light flipping stuff with 50 pound and like up to like, say like 5/8 of an ounce. Right. I'll still use that stuff. Love it. I just take a black Sharpie and make it dark, you know?
That's a great tip, by the way. Black Sharpie to make it dark. Real quick, like before we go further, and I want to stop you right there. Tell people why you black Sharpie the line on braid.
So for me, I just feel like if I'm going into that cavernous darkness, that milfoil patch or that, duckweed or eelgrass, like, I don't know, it's dark in there, like fish are in there because it's dark. I don't want my fluorescent, line that I can see really good when it's going from the tip of my rod and entering the water, like I like to have that high vis braid no matter what size line I'm using. But like I want like 3 feet of it. I just literally I take a big, thick, flat Sharpie and I take a X-Acto knife or a razor blade and I literally just slice it. And then my line just slides in it really easy. And I just go back and forth with like 3 feet, like, or pull it through a few times and you're good. Or once you're rigged up, if it starts to kind of turn back to yellow and green and teal like that cast stuff again, you just poke your Sharpie into it and go up and down a few times and you can darken it up again. I mean, usually I'm punching and pitching and flipping. It's not a dock fishing thing. I'm using fluorocarbon when I'm by docks, but when I'm in that vegetation, I'm flipping to the darkness. Those fish are living in the dark. So I go with dark line.
You don't want bright line popping them in the face as it's coming through milfoil in the dark cavern that they're living in.
Yeah, I just think it blends in a little better. There's a lot of shadows down there where they're hiding. So
before we move to our next line, like what kind of techniques besides, finesse fishing with a spinning rod and frogging, like is there any other techniques that you throw braid with?
So braids, like, let's talk about the principles a bit. Zero stretch, right? It does tend to float. They make some sinking braids, but that stuff still, it doesn't sink. It doesn't sink like you think it would. So a lot like mono, floats. Zero stretch though, complete opposite of mono. So anything where you need to get a big hook into a fish really firmly. It's also really sensitive since there is no stretch in that line. There's no vibrations dampened. You can feel the bite as good as possible. So if you're fishing a bottom contact bait, and you need to feel a transition from soft bottom to hard bottom or vice versa, it gives you so much feedback. So it's a great time to use it is whenever you really need to feel your way through that kind of stuff. So anything bottom contact, anytime you don't want stretch, especially if you're using a big wide gap hook, I mean, flipping, jigging, anything with a spinning rod so that, while we're fishing for smallmouth, we want to be able to count the hairs on the back of a crawfish. Like, it's those principles, understanding that you're going to get a lot of benefits from braid if you're using it in the right situations.
I like it. Yeah. I love braid for topwater fishing. And I know some people will put like a mono bumper on it. Some people put a fluoro bumper. I just put a bigger O-ring on the front of my topwater bait to keep it away from tangling in the hooks, especially on a walking bait. And I mean, I love it. The only thing I do find is depending on the rod I use, and this is before I started using all alpha rods, is that depending on what hook I put on my topwater baits, when I'd run that straight braid, I would actually flex out a lot of hooks and lose fish.
You can, yeah.
And that's just because I horse everything in because I wanted it in the boat. So it's probably my own fault.
I mean, like, we all have our own style, right? Like, everybody fights a fish differently. And yeah, I mean, that's the hard part, right? There's no stretch in that line, yet we're using treble hooks when you're using a walking bait, right? Yeah. You get amazing casting distance out of that super soft and super smooth line, and you can get a hook set on them a mile away, right? Like, you swing a 7-foot topwater walking rod or a 610, you have a really quick connection to move those hooks into a fish and get a good hook set on a smallmouth bass that has a very hard mouth because they've spent the beginning of the year eating a lot of crawfish when they're coming out of their winter pattern. Crawfish is one of the first forage they get into, so their mouths are very, very hard. But then when you get close to the boat, there's no stretch in that system. So you're like, oh gosh, like, please stay down, don't jump, like, it's tough. It's the game we play, right?
Yeah, it happens. It's fishing.
So,
super lines. We're going to jump to our last line here because there's a lot of like weird lines out there, like polymers and fluorocarbon coated monofilaments that we're not really going to dive into because I feel like there's not really a place for those lines, in my opinion. But
agreed.
Fluorocarbon is a major mainstay not just in bass fishing, but all fishing. And
Mhm.
you can buy it in spools of like 2 pound test all the way to 25 and 30. And fluorocarbon you can use in a lot of places that you can use braided line, but because it has a no stretch principle, but we all know fluorocarbon stretches a little bit. But kind of dive into fluorocarbon here, and I'm going to give some points after you talk about it a little bit.
I mean, so fluorocarbon is supposedly, and I agree with 99% of this opinion, is almost invisible, right? Everybody says it's the invisible line. There's like no light refraction or whatever. Fish don't see it, right? So uh, it's awesome. Clear water techniques. You want to be using fluorocarbon for sure. Um, there are some brands that stretch way more than others. You even see brands like Sunline making cranking, labeling that line like FC cranking versus FC flipping. You want less stretch in a flipping technique than a cranking technique, right? So you see, there's other brands that are say this lineup of this certain part aspect of their, like, we'll just say Seagar, right? Invisex, a lot less stretch in Advisex than a Brazex. A Brazex, there's a ton of stretch in it. And I'm sure when you go to Yozuri and some of the other brands that I'm less familiar with, I'm sure they're doing the exact same thing, right? They're making some that have more stretch than others because some techniques you want a little more stretch in than others. The other big aspect of fluorocarbon that everybody has to be super familiar with is it sinks. So we talked about 2 floating lines before. Fluorocarbon's a sinking line. So it's important that everybody kind of knows it behaves differently. The way it sits on the surface when you first make a cast and then starts to bow down to your bait. It behaves much differently. And there are definitely techniques that you want those sinking principles of that line. And there's certain like you don't want to be trying to walk a topwater bait with fluorocarbon, because what happens is after it lands on the water, surface tension holds it up, but eventually the weight of that line is going to start to make it kind of bow down and sink, and the middle of your cast is going to start to get 6 inches, 12 inches, 18 inches under the surface. And that makes it very hard to move a walking bait, right? So you would never
Or
want to
pupper,
use
because it
fluorocarbon.
makes it dive as opposed to
Yeah.
chug. So
Yeah. So, I mean, it's got much different principles, and it needs to be used, in the right applications. A spinnerbait is a great place to use fluorocarbon. Spinnerbait has a big hook on it, but it still is a reaction bait. So, like a big size 25 pound test fluorocarbon is a great line for a spinnerbait. If you're going with mono, like you said before, Andrew, you need a much stiffer rod, something that's more of a fast action and not a parabolic bend, because you need to be able to lock into that fish much more quickly. So yeah.
as fluorocarbon, you can get away with like a composite rod or an S glass rod, like a chatterbound from Alpha Angler. You can
Yeah.
open it up the realm of a lot of different rods to use with fluorocarbon because of that quote unquote no stretch, like proprietary technology they put into fluoro. But like, and I think there's one really cool thing that people overlook a lot with fluorocarbon, and when it comes to finesse fishing, people will be like, "Yeah, I can get away with fishing 10 or 12 pound tests on my drop shot because it's invisible." But I think it's important to note here is yes, it is invisible. It's like 99% invisible to fish underneath the water, but when you're fishing a finesse technique like a drop shot, it's so important to understand what your bait is doing underneath the water. Go sit underneath the pool and have your wife or girlfriend or whoever your spouse is or friend cast it in as you're laying on the bottom and put 12-pound test and 6-pound test and see how much more lifelike your bait is on 6-pound test. The
Yeah.
lighter your fluorocarbon is, the less, I guess, I lost the my train of thought here for a second. But the way the line, the suppleness of that line when it's
Mhm.
underneath water becomes more when that line is less. So it's more free swinging. It gives your bait way more natural presentation, and it's
There
still
you go.
very strong if you know how to tie a proper knot. Like
For sure.
I boat flipped a 4.5 pound smallie today on 6 pound tatsu
Do it all
fluorocarbon
the time.
leader. So yeah, it's knots and making sure there's no nicks.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I mean, that line is so it can be a little more brittle than monofilament, right?
yeah,
Like, since there is no stretch, when it goes, right? But you can all if you kind of understand how to tie a knot and make those like, say you use a Palomar knot. I'm a Palomar knot guy. I know some people are very pro San Diego Jam and some others, but as long as your fibers or however your knot is designed to lays perfectly, so there's not crisscrosses and fluoro on fluoro rubbage. I mean, dude, you can boat flip fish that are 6 pounds on 6 pound test if you're not loading that line improperly. But as soon as you kind of yank it really firmly and or not firmly, really sharply, it is brittle. It'll pop. But if you do things the right way and have a good feel for the stuff that you're using, you don't have to worry that much.
yeah, I love it. I've accidentally boat flipped 6 pound smallies before with the spinning rod with 6 pound test, and I'm like, I probably shouldn't have
Oops.
done that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
retie my knot now.
Yeah. Yeah.
'Cause- and I think that's like an important thing to know, like with fluorocarbon too, is, and I don't know if this is something you believe in, but when I tie my knots, first I always get it wet, but I don't like cinch it as hard as I can down, because I found when I cinch it really hard down on the hook, like really tug and pull, make sure it's tight, I break a lot of fish off. So what I started doing was like giving it a half cinch. So I just kind of like pop it tight, but I don't really lean on my knots, because when you set the hook the first time, I feel like it sets it perfectly. And I stopped breaking off at the knot.
So for me, I mean, I don't tie this up. I might get blown up in the comments on this, but I tie a Palomar knot for everything. I mean, I've tied Palomar knots on A-rigs. I don't care. Like, because this is the thing, right? For me, and it's different for everybody. And for me, if you make those figure eights when you're done and you start to tighten down a Palomar, when those figure eights lay, as long as there's no twist and no overlapping, and those two lanes of line run perfectly side by side without ever twisting and flipping, when you cinch it down, you don't have to yank on it. I'm not a yanker either. So, like,
And you
you
can
know,
cinch it, just make sure it's wet, and you don't want to like really lean on, just get it
yeah.
snug.
And never that,
Yeah.
like, don't whack it like
So
you
many
do with a
people do
jerk
that,
bait.
and they
Yeah.
wonder
Oh,
why
yeah.
they break fish off when they
Yeah.
set the hook with fluorocarbons, because they get the knot tied on that beautiful jig, got the trailer on there, and they're like,
Yeah.
okay, it's good, and then they make it flip it. Oh, it must have been a pike. No, buddy, you're not, because you've already
Yeah.
broke it trying to cinch it down as tight as you can.
Yeah.
Ugh.
It's I mean, I hate to beat a dead horse, but I mean, it is kind of a pillar of serious anglers. So I'll say it again. Understanding every part of your system is important. And we could do a whole nother show on knots, but you need that to understand your lines first,
Yeah, we
like,
just wanted to have a basic chat about lines, because
yeah,
it's so important to make sure you apply the proper line to the proper technique with
yeah,
the proper rod and reel. And I
yeah,
feel like that's like episodes that we can just have on, is like the proper rods for generic simple techniques and reel speeds. Like, so many people get the reel speeds wrong for techniques, which you would never think could happen, but it happens. And like, the last thing you really want to do is throw a deep diving crankbait on an 8-to-1 when the water temp is 43 degrees. You can't
oh,
slow
God.
down enough. Like,
Yeah.
or if they want to be eating it when it's 72 degrees, it might be a good idea to throw it on an 8-to-1, but you have to make sure you
Yeah.
have the right rod for it when they eat. So like,
Yeah.
there's so many crazy nuances that we could dive into that I'm sure we will uncover at some point in time here in the Lure Lab, because it's more than just about baits and techniques. There's a lot of stuff that go into it to apply the perfect action to your technique to get more bass in the boat or on the bank. So
Yeah.
line is a very important first step.
So, and a thing, something that I just kind of want to follow up on too is, so, and you started to hit on it, and I didn't want to interrupt before, which is why I did now. So, when you're choosing your lines, first you want to choose line for how the line presents the lure, right? And then the second half of it is you want your line to assist you getting that fish in the boat, right? And sometimes you can't always have the best of both worlds. So you're thinking of the first part, you get the bite, and then you're just hoping that you can be as efficient and a little bit lucky sometimes as possible to then get them in the boat. Presentation first, choose that line to present a bait as naturally as possible, as you said, and then choose that line secondarily to help you land that fish. So, I mean, sometimes we choose too big a line because we know we're going to land the fish, but then the bait doesn't look natural and we don't get as many bites.
Yeah. Another thing too, before we end this show, Joe, I do want to bring up one more thing that a lot of people might not know, and that is line diameter size, right?
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
so if I have a 20-pound bulk spool sitting here, and hopefully you guys can see it, but there's a line diameter, if you'll clear up here, which it won't, but the line diameter on this is 0.016, or basically 405 millimeters.
Mm-hmm.
What you should always do is look at the diameter of lines when you pick them up when you're in the store, because some will be thicker than the 20-pound test that I have here in diameter, and some will be thinner. And that's all based on the construction of the line. But then you can really kind of get confused if you grab a monofilament or a braid on the same pound test. It's completely off. Like a 20-pound braid, and you can tell me I'm wrong here, is normally like what, 6-pound diameter on like a
Monofilament.
mono or
Yeah.
like fluorocarbon, and then
Yeah. It's probably 4 to 6. Yeah.
yeah, and then a 20-pound mono is probably like a 0.20 diameter. It's a much thicker line than a fluorocarbon, and it's based on break strength.
I
Like
I think mono is actually thinner than fluoro. I
I'll
think
have
it
to double
is.
check that. I'm not sure, but I'm just saying check the diameter of it,
Yeah.
because that will also tell you how much line you can put on your spool. So like with Seaguar and Vizex, if you have a Tatula SV and you want to put 15-pound test on, you might be able to get 20 more feet out of a different brand that has a thinner line with the same break strength, or you might lose 20 feet if you buy a thicker gauge 15-pound test from another brand. So
Yep.
just always be cognizant of that, and just know the thinner your line diameter is, you're probably going to have more casting distance, and you might lose some memory. You might gain some memory. So go out, play with a bunch of different lines, and figure out which one you like best. I think is my best advice. And just try to take like a basic principles from this episode to make sure you choose the proper line for the technique that you want to fish. Like if you're going to throw a frog, don't throw mono or fluorocarbon with a frog. Make sure you fish it with a braid. With
Yeah.
top water, you could have mono or braid. Finesse fishing, almost always fluorocarbon to like a braid mainline, except one exception, a tube. In my opinion, you always throw a tube on
Some,
fluorocarbon.
yeah.
Always.
I mean, some people like the stretchy, uh, the elasticness you
Yeah.
can get out of using that system, that line to your advantage. So for sure.
But the only time, I'll put a side note out, the only time I like to throw a tube on straight fluoro is when I'm in like 15 foot or less. If I'm out deep dragging, it has to be braid to fluoro, because sometimes that tube is 150, 200 feet, 300 feet
Yeah.
from the boat, and you need some to get
Yep.
that fish hooked properly. So,
Agreed.
yeah.
So one big thing too, for anybody who may have this question and is a little inexperienced in the purchase process of line, when you go to buy fluoro, make sure you're not buying those little itty bitty dinky
Oh
spools
yeah, that's a
of
good point.
leader. It's super expensive for the amount of for the line capacity you get. It might only be like 40 yards of line. That leader material has almost zero stretch in it. It is a little more brittle because it doesn't stretch. The tensile strength is that would be lower, right? No stretch. It's strong, 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 and then pop because there's no stretch in it. It is super invisible. A lot of people, have started really experimenting with it. It actually came from the fly fishing world because when they're whipping it through the air, they don't want any stretch at all in that stuff. So there's not a whip action. But to be honest, Andy, I don't know if you've messed around with it. I keep going back to Tatsu and Daiwa Samurai for my leader. Like I didn't get into buying the actual leader stuff. I didn't think it had the abrasion resistance for a lot of my bottom contact smallmouth
Yeah, I'm the same way. I buy
techniques.
bulk spools because I rip through line like crazy with leaders. So I'm running Tatsu or I'll run like Gamma Edge as fluorocarbon leader, and I
I
buy a
think it
big
has
spool.
more I think it just has more abrasion resistance for zebra muscly bodies of water.
I agree. That is a great tip. Thank you, Joe. So I just want to say we're going to wrap it up here. So I want to say thank you for joining us, Joe. I'm going to let you
Appreciate it.
go get some sleep. Everyone who's tuning in on a Saturday morning, as you know, these episodes are pre-recorded here on the Lure Lab. But before I let Joe, well, actually, no, I'm just going to wrap up the episode and then we'll get off of here. But I just want to say thank you to everyone who tunes in every week. Also to the awesome guests who join us every week here in the lab. It's been really fun. I think this is like episode 34 now or 35. So we're moving and chugging right along. We love the feedback that we're getting on YouTube. And if you're here on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button, throw the thumbs up, leave some comments down below, like maybe like your favorite fluorocarbon or what techniques you use with what type of line. I love to see that stuff. If you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review. It helps this podcast get jumped to the front line and be seen by more bass heads who like to tune in and catch a lot of fish. So, but until next Saturday, we hope you enjoy this episode and we will see you then.